representatives. So we're always happy to have elected officials or elected officials to come to our events because they ultimately make a lot of the policies that we're dealing with here. Scott and I, many of you heard us on KKOB this morning, Bob Clark show. We also went to Santa Fe today and met with several different political leaders up there. Literally saw Kathy McCoy and a few other legislators coming out of an office of the building and invited ourselves to lunch with them. They let us come with them, so that was nice of them. And this pension problem and the government employment problem are two big issues, interrelated and intertwined. And it's something that you're not seeing necessarily as the crisis du jour because the state's trying to solve an immediate pending budget issue. But this is the crisis behind the crisis that's really driving a lot of the problems in New Mexico and is going to be a bigger and bigger problem. And if you've seen, there's been a lot of reporting recently. Bloomberg had a story. Reason Magazine, one of my favorite publications, the Libertarian Magazine, they had an excellent story talking about California's incredible pension situation where after you hit 50 years old, you can lock in 90% of your top salary level for life in California. It's unbelievable. So people will get 2 jobs at the very end or somehow game the system so that they can lock in these disproportionate salaries. So Scott's going to be talking a lot about all of these issues, and by all means, if you have questions, this is pretty heavy stuff, but ask questions of him and he'll be happy to let you know what he's thinking. So without further ado, Scott is an adjunct scholar with the Rio Grande Foundation. He did come to sunny New Mexico. He flew into the Sunport, so he knew he was in the right place. He figured he'd been living in darkness for the last 3 months, so anything's an improvement in that regard. But he has 10 years of economic policy research and economic modeling experience from his work with the Tax Foundation and Heritage Foundation. He's authored and co-authored over 50 published articles and books, testified twice before House Ways and Means Committee of the U.S. Congress, has been invited to speak before various organizations such as National Conference of State Legislators and ALEC, that's American Legislative Exchange Council. His work has appeared in Forbes, CNN Money, State Tax Notes, the New York Sun, and several newspapers in Maine because he works out of Maine a lot as well. And he is on the board of directors of the Council for Community and Economic Research and is on the editorial board of the Journal for Applied Research and Economic Development, co-published by the University of Southern Mississippi. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Wingate in North Carolina, and he received his master's from George Mason University. So please welcome Scott Moody.
Thank you, Paul. Can everybody hear me okay? I've been talking a lot today, so I don't know. Yeah, if you can, I'll pick up the mic, but I'm talking a lot today, so I don't know how my voice is doing. As Paul said, I thank you for coming out and listening to one of the most difficult topics to talk about in public policy today. This issue is far from transparent, and in fact, to write this study, I had to go through 100-page actuarial reports, and I don't know if there are any actuaries in the room, but I tell you, it makes some of the economic work I do look like some pretty light lifting. But when I started this project, I do want you to know that when I started, I did have hair. So I just want to give you fair warning about how complicated some of this stuff is. But we've been boiling it down, and our goal here tonight is to educate you on this problem. It's widespread. It's not just New Mexico's problem. It's pretty wide-ranging across all the U.S. states, and a lot of states are facing even bigger problems. And quite frankly, it's, if not the largest fiscal problem out there, it's definitely in the top 3, and you'll be hearing a lot more about it in the coming years. Right now, we're really on the precipice of this issue bursting onto the scene, and it's precisely because it's not transparent. And it's been swept under the rug for decades, and they're finally being called out on it by the Government Accounting Standards Board, which oversees these particular issues. And they finally said, look, you guys have to bring this out into the open. And as they are, the picture is not very, very good. Now, this presentation is actually based on a three-part series. Many of the reports were handed out. Unfortunately, we didn't have copies for everybody tonight, but they are on the website. Only the first two of the series have been published so far. The third is still pending. It's dealing with solutions to this problem, but it is in this presentation, a little preview, if you will, of coming attractions. And so that'll be out shortly. So that's what this presentation is based on. So if you have a copy in front of you, you can, all the charts, most of the charts and tables are in the copies. Otherwise, when we're done tonight, you can go to the website, Rio Grande Foundation, and download them. The first study we did was looking at really what's the root cause of New Mexico's pension and retiree health care problem. And that's the size, the overall size of the state and local government workforce. First, let's just look at absolute numbers. This chart goes back to 1969, which is as far back as you can get the data from federal statistical agencies. And you can see that's pretty much a 45-degree angle. And today, almost 170,000 state and local government workers in New Mexico. That includes higher education, that includes K through 12, as well as other state agencies that you would more readily identify. Now, by itself, that looks pretty alarming, but in reality, that may not be a problem if, of course, the economy's grown faster than state and local government employment. Unfortunately, that's not been the case. In fact, government in New Mexico is New Mexico's largest industry. You can compare it to wholesale and retail trade, healthcare and social assistance, accommodations and food services, which is tourism. You would think that would be bigger. And actually, manufacturing and mining are last in that list, which might surprise some people. Now, as I said, if government's growing faster than the general economy, then, well, or if the private economy is growing faster than government employment, that may not be a problem. What I've done here in this first chart is I've adjusted employment relative to the private sector. So New Mexico employs roughly 26 employees for every 100 private sector employees. The national average is just under 17. That's 51% higher than the national average. It's the second highest level of government employment in the country. And the popular question is, well, who's number one? Alaska is number one. New Hampshire, where I'm from, is something like 49th. So those are the two ends of your spectrum.
Scott, I have a question about that real quick, if you don't
Yep.
mind. Is there a way to view that adjusted for the size of the state? You know, Alaska has a lot of land and really no people, relatively speaking. New Mexico and the other one you mentioned, was it Montana, or some of the less densely populated states?
Right.
Is there a way to adjust for that, or is that just?
Well, this is adjusted for private sector. I mean, I don't see on the face of it how the size of the state necessarily would affect your private sector necessarily. Yes,
Could you just do it as a percentage of per capita or percentage?
well, that is one measure of doing it. The reason why I don't like per capita is because you include a lot of population that don't pay taxes effectively. And particularly in a state like New Mexico or a Maine, where the retiree population is a huge part of your population, it's really kind of misleading because the private sector is the one bearing that burden right there that you're seeing. So in my opinion, that is your metric that you want to compare yourself to, because the government is the one is competing directly with the private sector for quality employees. So in this sense, another way you can interpret this is government is crowding out the private sector.
Okay, well, it says up there per number of state and local government jobs per 100 private sector jobs.
That's
that
right.
still comes out to like a private per capita thing, kind of.
No, again, not in a state like New Mexico with a large retiree population. A lot of those folks aren't in the private job market.
And the federal workforce is not included in this at all.
Right, and then, yeah, and then the federal workforce as well would be excluded.
Okay, so the federal is not in this, the
No,
count?
it's in either
On
of
that
those.
or on this chart?
That's right.
Okay.
That's a whole other ball of wax.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I kind of going back to what Kent was maybe talking about, I've heard justifications over the years for our larger government workforce here because we are an expansive, geographically we're expansive. We're the fifth largest state in the country. And we have all these rural areas that require services, so therefore you have more government employment to serve. I'm not saying that's
Sure.
valid, but that's one of the
Well,
arguments.
that argument's actually used in a lot of states. It's actually used in Maine, for example. But hold that thought, because we're going to get further into this. Where is this overemployment? Maybe it'll help answer some of your questions. And frankly, you won't see any correlation with the size of the state.
I'm not surprised.
Now, the one thing I do want to point out about this chart is look at that line. It's flat. This is not a recent problem. It goes all the way back to 1969. This is a systemic problem that New Mexico has faced for a very, very long time. And as Paul's been pointing out too, I mean, some of it is, the private sector just hasn't taken off either in New Mexico. I mean, that's the other side of the equation in all this. And you can solve it in one of two ways. Now I want to talk about another issue that you'll often hear is that, well, the average state and local government worker earns significantly less than your average private sector worker. So in a way, it all balances it out, right? Well, that might have been true in the past. It's not true today. You can see prior to, say, 1984, that was true that the average state and local worker earned less than the private sector. But since then, that line has been clearly above zero. Not so much at the national level, it's been hovering around zero, but in New Mexico, it's been trending upwards pretty steadily. Now, this is total compensation, which includes wages and salaries and benefits. And then you can see at the bottom, New Mexico has the 10th highest compensation ratio in the country as well. So you have two problems. You have overemployment and overcompensation. What's the source of this? Benefits. You can see that New Mexico for a long time not only was below the private sector, when it's below zero, when it's negative down there, that means the average pay is below the private sector pay. But when it goes above zero, it's higher. You see, not only was it below private sector, it's also below the national average. But since the early 90s, that's changed, where it's now above the national average. And that's really what's been driving the increase in the compensation levels. 11th highest benefit ratio. Yes, sir.
Over in the far right, that even includes Gary Johnson's terms, I take it. Even as he was governor, this inflationary thing occurred?
I'm sorry.
This inflation to the job benefits was occurring even when he was governor, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been happening through many years.
Yeah.
And I'm going to talk more about this later. The reason is because it's very easy to promise benefits whose costs are 10, 20, 30 years out. And you'll see that more clearly in some other slides as we get to them. Wage and salary, by the way, is nothing to laugh at either. You have the 10th highest ratio in the wage and salary. I just really want to show this one because this one is really the driver that's driving the overall compensation.
The one thing you can notice on this one is it kind of dips a bit when Gary Johnson was in there, and then right around 02 when Richardson takes off, it skyrockets up.
Well, I really want to, I mean, these numbers are really, it's hard to peg these on any one particular administration simply because, you got the economy moving through these numbers and everything like that. These contracts that are written are very long term. So a lot of the fluctuations you see are probably driven more by the economy than necessarily any.
Plus most benefits, the actual costs don't occur for 10 years.
Yes, that's the other thing too. So what you're seeing is, you got to imagine, probably the policy that implemented was probably 10 years prior to that. And then that's why you're seeing this slow, if you look at that chart, you're seeing the trend line slowly shift upwards. And that's a result of just accumulation of benefits being approved over time. So, in one current year, if we were to adjust these ratios back to the national average, if we adjusted the employment ratio back in just 1 year, we could save $2.6 billion. You got to understand, the total payroll is about $8.3 billion in the state. Employment is 20% of the workforce, and the payroll is about 18% of total earnings in the state. So these are huge sums. So people look at 2.6, oh, we can't save that. Well, you spend over 8.3. So yes, those savings are achievable. And then if we adjust the compensation ratio, that's another $700 million. But again, clearly the problem is the overemployment. Now, where is the overemployment? And this will hopefully get at some of the questions being asked earlier. Really, the part I've highlighted in red is where the vast majority of the overemployment is K through 12 instructional, higher educational instructional, and higher education other. And that includes things like administrative bureaucracy, it includes things like campus security guards, etc. Basically any non-instructional activities that go on. And that can be a result of the sheer number, as Paul was telling you earlier, the sheer number of various campuses that New Mexico has. I mean, think about all the redundancy that you have to have, all the maintenance crews, all the security guards, just duplicated, administration, duplicated in every one of these locations. Another one that I didn't highlight because it's a problem when compared to other states, but isn't compared to K through 12 and higher education isn't a problem in an absolute sense. But that's corrections, where you actually rank #1 in the country in terms of overemployment ratios. So, to get back to the question, is it geography? Well, I don't see how geography affects higher education. I mean, you know, you see Maine, for example, in their higher education has 7 campuses for a population of 1.3 million people. And of course, their chart looks a lot like yours. So again, whereas a state like New Hampshire has many fewer campuses. I mean, that's really a public policy decision. I don't see how any other factor would drive that problem. So it's just a decision to make that, hey, we're just not going to do higher education this way, or we're not going to do K through 12 this way. And that also leads us to why the fact that overemployment has been such a problem for so long. Because, well, I mean, how long has, you know, higher education been around in New Mexico? You know, certainly post-World War II. Yes, sir.
Aren't most teachers and people like Ellen Bernstein going to say, well, you know, class sizes are too big, we need more teachers? Isn't that the usual?
Well, I'm sure they'll argue that. Again, that's a public policy question, and it's a discussion we have to have.
Well, one of my son is in a class that has like 200 people in it. That's a pretty good sized class. So I don't know what they're doing as far as distributing their money. Maybe they don't. Maybe the money's not going to teachers.
Well,
What grade? What grade?
This is higher education, university.
200.
well, certainly, but you
This
know,
classroom that holds 100
200, 300 people, you know. That's a lot.
Well, I came from California, it's like
Well, but I mean, that's still a
you
lot.
needed binoculars to actually,
Well, that's a good way to teach.
I had 2,000 in my high school grade.
you know, Paul brings out this great cartoon from this weekend's newspaper, and you know, it shows the University of Mexico Higher Education Administration, and his 2010 resolution is to go on a diet, but in the trash can it says his 2009 resolution was to beef up. And here's a whole filing cabinet of vice presidents' positions, 3 filing cabinets, all alphabetized, basically telling you, hey, we got too many vice presidents. So,
Exactly.
you know, there's administrative overhead, and you know, even the class size thing. I mean, I don't quite get that argument. I mean, the internet right now, 1 million people could watch a professor give a lecture. Does that diminish the quality of the lecture to the next person who looks at it? Not necessarily. So, you know, particularly in the age of the internet, you really have to question, do we need so many campuses? Do we need so many specialized instructors when now you can have one instructor teach millions of people through the internet? Just look at the YouTube phenomena, right? So clearly, in today's day and age, where information is, the value of information or the cost of information has gone practically zero. It really makes you really need to start questioning the entire structure, particularly when you're paying such a high price for it. $2.6 billion is a very high price to be paid for this kind of redundancy. Now let's get into the hard stuff, which is New Mexico's pension problem. New Mexico has two basic pension systems, one for educational employees, higher education, K through 12, and then all other state government employees. What this chart is showing you is the health of those trust funds, in essence. What happens is the state makes a contribution into a trust fund, as well as the employees, although the employee share is very small. That trust fund grows over time, and the goal is that when these folks retire, the trust fund is large enough to pay their retirement benefits. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The dark lines show the assets, the solid lines show the assets of the two respective funds. The dotted lines show the liabilities. Now, for public employees, the dotted line and the solid gray lines are very close. That one's actually much more closely to being fully funded. The educational, however, you see, has the biggest gap of the two. In total, liabilities exceed assets by $4.5 billion. Now, also note, look at the trends, if you will, of the various lines. Liabilities have been growing significantly faster than the assets. And that's a combination of two things. One, the stock market hasn't been performing very well in other investments over the last 5, 10 years even. In fact, I think the stock market, it has been, what are they calling it, the lost decade, where right now the values are what they were exactly 10 years ago. We've gone up, we've gone down, we've gone up and gone down, but at the end of the day, it's a wash. So, investments haven't been keeping up, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Secondly, the state has not been meeting its minimal contribution. Now you say, well, how can they do that? Well, they can, and then I'll talk more about how they do that. I mean, it's sort of like not even meeting the minimum payment on your credit card. Not a good thing to do. Now, the bad news is that $4.5 billion I just told you about is dramatically understated. The reason is because the Government Accounting Standard Board allows pension funds to make shall I say, very rosy estimates of the rates of return on those investments. New Mexico assumes about 8 to 8.5% rate of return. It varies by fund, which is just simply unrealistically high. So two economists from Illinois, from University of Chicago and Northwestern, said, well, what if we adjust it? For example, private sector pension funds have to use a rate of about 6%. They argue that it should be even lower because, well, theoretically, governments don't go broke. Theoretically. We'll be putting that to the test in the next 5 to 10 years.
What timeline horizon do these people do these projections?
They're required to do it for 30 years, these forecasts.
So is it segmented 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years?
No, I mean, it's just usually given, I mean, that amount, the $4.5 billion, for example, is that 30-year window discounted to the present value. So in other words, if the state government, everybody's state government and local government retired today, we would have to pony up $4.5 billion in a real hurry to pay for their retiree benefits. That's what that means. So, using more realistic discount rates, the pension liability alone ranges from a minimum $7.3 billion all the way up to $22.9 billion, which is 3 times greater than all the general obligation bond currently outstanding by the state. Now, the difference between the two is that you can't ever skip a payment on a general obligation bond. Unfortunately, you have a little bit more wiggle room in the pension liability. Now, the $22.9 billion is the unfunded portion. If you take out the assets, the total liability, the very top liability, is $45 billion. If you take that as a percent of GDP, it's almost 60%, which is the 3rd highest percentage in the country. So the burden that New Mexico's economy will face in the coming years as a percent of GDP will be crushing. Because, in my opinion, the 22.9 is the more closely correct. And the reason is, this will get a little wonky for non-investor types, but the reason is because the pension system is more like an annuity system. In other words, it's all about cash flow, not about appreciation. So to get 8 to 8.5% return, you've got to invest in things that appreciate: stocks, bonds, hedge funds, and other type assets, when in reality, they should be investing in government security bonds that pay an outlay. Because the problem, as we all know right now, we're getting a huge lesson, is volatility. Stock prices can go up and they can go down in a big hurry. The problem is benefits don't go down. You owe them year after year after year, and if you lose $1 billion in the stock market and suddenly you can't pay benefits, well, you're going to have to borrow it, or you're going to be in a big heap of trouble.
Putting it in T-bills instead of stocks and bonds just shifts the debt from one spot to another.
Well,
The rest of us still end up paying it one way or another.
well, that's a bigger problem, but yes, and they don't have to necessarily be government bonds; they could be corporate bonds. But the point is, it has to be a vehicle that pays cash flow every year through interest or dividend. Yes, sir.
Well, assuming that, well, maybe that's the wrong assumption, but a T-bill right now, what are they running at? Yesterday was 5.5, 5.6.
Off the top of my head, I don't know, but I think that's about right.
6.5 figure is probably generous. And has been for a year or two.
30 years.
Right.
Would be my,
That'd be what?
that the 6.5 is probably a high figure based on what the market's really paying for a bond,
Right.
for a secured bond.
Right. But the moral of the story is that you can't assume high rates of return without also factoring in the volatility risk, which can be severe, as we're seeing. And that's what these two economists are arguing. And the problem is the bond rating agencies listen to these people. And we're going to talk about that by the end of this presentation. Now, you think that story is depressing? Let's talk about retiree health care. Right now, the state has set aside a whopping $171 million for a $3.1 billion liability. That's a funded ratio of less than 6%. So, in essence, what the state is doing is paying this on a pay-as-you-go basis, which means these are the current costs this year, that's all we're paying. We're not going to try to defray the cost moving forward. Now, if it makes you feel any better, every other state in the union is just as bad. But it shouldn't make you feel any better because this is your liability. So regardless of what other states are doing, somebody's going to have to fix this problem here in this state. Now, as we know with the current healthcare debate, the problem with this number is that healthcare costs are rising at double-digit inflation rates. So it has come down a little bit, and that's because the state did do something positive last year, which was require retirees to pay a little bit more of their insurance costs. So that's brought down the liability a little bit. But you can expect it to go right back up again when you're faced with double-digit inflation rates. And you can also see, unlike the pensions, I only have 2 years' worth of data. The reason for that is because the Government Accounting Standards Board only ruled that states had to quantify this in 2004. So for 50 years, 60 years, we've been completely flying blind on this. Paul was saying earlier, it's kind of like kicking the can down the road. I said, no, it's not like kicking the can down the road because you don't even know the can's there in this case. So you were just completely flying blind. Yes, sir.
So are these figures for the gap between a person who retires before Medicare age, paying
Yes.
for their health care until they're eligible for Medicare?
Well, no, I mean, this covers the whole you can have this till you die. But the real problem with this is because the pension benefits are so generous, people retire at 50.
Yeah.
And you're looking at 30, 40, potentially 50 years, depending on how well health care gets, of paying for this.
In New Mexico, do we pay for healthcare of retirees that are over 65?
Yes.
So they're getting benefits above and beyond Medicare.
So their benefits are actually higher than their salary.
Wow.
And now you know why that benefit line is going exponential. Is there another? That was another question. And that's exactly right. And not to trump myself, but later West Virginia became the first state to eliminate this entirely. And that's one reason to argue for doing so. Why have this if you have Medicare? The only thing you're doing is subsidizing people who take early retirement.
Right.
And we simply can't afford to subsidize people becoming unproductive at a very early age.
However, the question is whether Medicare actually costs us more or less.
Right, well, Medicare's a whole other issue, but to have two systems
That's the basis of
Yeah. makes it worse.
whether or not you do that.
Right. Of course, if this one goes bankrupt too, it doesn't matter. Now let's look at the annual bill that we're paying. This is for the employer's schedule of pension contributions. So this is the state contributions to the educational fund and the public employees fund. Three things I want to point out in this chart. Number one is over this 10-year period, annual contributions have already doubled from about a little more than $300 million to almost $700 million annually. Now, if you'll know, about 2003, the line has also shifted upwards, the trend. And if that trend line since 2003 continues, costs will double not in 10 years, but more like 5 years. So can you imagine if it goes from $700 million to $1.4 billion? And actually, this only goes to 2008, so that would be about 2013, only 3 years from now. The third thing I want to show you is the dotted line is what the state actually made. So since about 2004, the state hasn't even been meeting its minimal contribution to the pension funds, which means they're kicking the can down the road. And it's actually a very tempting thing to do politically, because think about it, that you save $200 million today, but that $200 million gets amortized over 30 years. So the pain basically gets wiped out politically. So when faced with a budget crisis, as we are today, it's very easy to skimp on this, and unfortunately, it's allowed. It's not like a general obligation bond where you skip an interest and dividend, an interest payment and a principal payment, and the rating agencies will come down on you really hard, really fast. Here, it's taken them a while, but they're finally catching up. Now, the retiree health care bill, however, is even more grossly underfunded on an annual basis. As I said before, it's only made on a pay-as-you-go basis, which means about $80 million per year is all you need to pay any given year's benefits without the amortized payment of the unfunded portion. If you did that, they should be paying closer to $300 million per year. That number's going to get big very fast the longer we delay finally meeting that.
Millions of dollars on top of it. Should that be millions?
Typo.
Oh, yeah, that's a typo.
Where? I was gonna say, $300 million.
It's not that bad.
That's the dangers of copy and paste, unfortunately. I probably copied it from the previous table and changed it. Good catch, I'll fix that. Now, the second half of the second study is really about, you have three options to deal with this problem. You can raise taxes to at least meet that minimal annual payment. You can cut other spending to meet that minimum annual payment. Or you can reduce the benefit levels to a more reasonable level. Well, from our perspective, we at the very least need to take option one off the table. We certainly don't need tax hikes in the middle of a recession to compound all these problems. Because again, the asset side of the equation depends on having a healthy economy, a healthy stock market. So if we do things collectively to damage the private sector and the stock market, we're only shooting ourselves in the foot twice actually. So the first time we're shooting ourselves in the foot is what we call, economists call deadweight losses. That's a fancy term for meaning when tax rates go up, you make certain investments unprofitable. And when they become unprofitable, you don't do them. And so that basically takes your growth potential in the state and downshifts it. And that is economic activity that's lost forever. And this is just sort of the graphical interpretation of what deadweight loss is. Graphically, what it does is it's the equivalent of an artificial price hike, right? If they came out tomorrow and said gasoline prices were doubled, what would that do to the economy? I mean, it's an artificial price hike, and it would do a lot of harm to the economy, as we saw with the recent spike in oil, which was a contributing factor to this recession. So there is a way to calculate these deadweight losses, and what I did is I assumed that the $285 million shortfall in 2008 was funded by an increase in the top marginal income tax rate at the time, in 2008. It would have required the top rate to go from 4.9% to 6.05%. That's a pretty large percentage increase. At the end of the day, what that means in today's dollars is almost $850 million of economic output just vanishing. Never will happen in the state. To put that into perspective, that would be the equivalent of taking all the tax revenue of the corporate income tax, motor vehicle license taxes, and the motor fuels tax, all the revenue in 2008, and just taking it out in the desert and burning it. If you can imagine what that would do to the economy. But you don't have to just take my word for it. According to Christina Romer and Dave Romer, it's a husband and wife economics team. They both taught at UC Berkeley until Christina Romer became the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. They jointly wrote a study that found that tax increases are highly contractionary, and the powerful negative effect of tax increases is predominantly on investments. And that's exactly what I just laid out to you. It affects investments and profitability. When investments don't become profitable, they don't happen. When they don't happen, the economy usually starts to contract. So, those are wise words when I'm sure we'll hear about the need to raise taxes at the federal level.
And when was this
sometime soon.
quote done?
This study was written in, I think, 2007 or so. The link is actually in the study. So if you're interested in seeing it. There are also two other studies I cite. This is the most interesting for political reasons. But the other two are just as significant and just as...
And this is on the RGF study.
Yes. So now let's start talking about some solutions. The first solution is the overemployment problem. If we can tackle that, we can also at the same time tackle the unfunded pension problem. The two are tied at the hip, if you will. Now think about it this way. For every position we eliminate, on average, the annual budget savings are about $50,000 per position. But more importantly, the liability associated with every position in today's dollars is about $287,000. So that's today's value. If you had to cash out today of their benefits, that's how much you would need to pay them out. 5 times the current annual budget savings. Now, of course, you won't actually get the $287,000 in a single year by eliminating that position. You'll get a little bit of it over that 30-year amortization period. And what that does is it lowers the annual state contribution required to make the pension system solvent. So that is solution number one. And one way to get at that is to enact a hiring freeze with real teeth and let attrition take its course. Attrition rate anywhere from 5 to 10% a year. Right there, you will start eliminating and shrinking the size of the government workforce. At the same time, for the positions you do refill, you're bringing in new employees, which then you can go to solution number 2 which is for new employees, eliminate the defined benefit program and institute a defined contribution system like 401ks in the private sector. That will then stop the hemorrhaging. Now, this is also doubly important for another legal reason, which is you cannot change the defined benefit program for current government workers. There's a lot of federal court cases that have ruled that those are private property rights and cannot be changed after the fact. So the only way to change them is to get them out of the system. So that's why attacking the overemployment problem is doubly powerful. You're getting around those folks that you're obligated to pay under the old system and installing a new person under a whole new regime that is much more taxpayer friendly than the current system. The good news is there's a strong tailwind, if you will, pushing in this direction. Now 3 states, and I don't know why I only listed 2, and actually I can't remember the third one as a result, but Michigan, Alaska just enacted a defined contribution system last year, and of all places, the District of Columbia has a defined contribution system. Well, Michigan, for that matter, is quite a surprise. The reason is you know, you're staring down this abyss, and there's no easy way out of it. And the third solution I've already touched on is having, for the retiree health care, is to have them pick up more of the tab, having the retirees pick up more of the tab. Fortunately, last session there was some movement in that direction for that particular program. That movement needs to continue. It's not nearly enough. But of course we can go all the way out to the most extreme point, which, as I mentioned earlier, West Virginia eliminating their system entirely. And again, West Virginia not exactly the bastion of free market thought in this country. So, but again, it's a state that was staring down the abyss of a dark hole in their budget, had no choice. They just simply have no choice. They can't afford it without short of declaring bankruptcy, which may be an option. As I said, California, I guess, probably being the poster child. So what happens if we ignore this? Well, let me give you an example. Next week, I'll be actually in Illinois talking about this very same problem. And it turns out, if you want to make yourself feel a little better, the state of Illinois is much further down the abyss. Their unfunded pension liability is $83 billion, with another $24 billion in unfunded healthcare liabilities, which is also completely unfunded, just as in New Mexico. They have had suffered 2 bond degradations in the same year. In April of 2009, Moody's dropped them from high grade, the lowest of the high grade bonds, to the highest of the median grade bonds. They then threatened to lower them again if they didn't get their pension system situation under control, and in December acted on that threat and lowered their bond rating again from A1 to A2. Standard & Poor's and Finch have both lowered their bond rating, and now Illinois has the second overall lowest bond rating in the country, behind, of course, the poster child of California. And all this has happened only within the last year. So the rating agencies are finally waking up to this reality, and they're not playing nice anymore. And as a result, this is going to mean that Illinois' future borrowing costs are all going to go up. So if you think you've got pressures of rising pension costs, think now they also have the added pressure of rising interest costs for all of their debt, not just their pension debt. Yes, sir?
Roughly how much is that increase for the debt cost? Is it 0.5%, 1 or 2%?
I off the top of my head, I don't know. I mean, it varies by state. You know what the market believes will shake down as a result of those bond degradations. But you know, 0.1% over a few $1 billion is a lot of money. You know what I mean? So that's the ramifications for doing nothing. Yes, ma'am.
How does double dipping fall into this? How does that affect New Mexico?
Well, double dipping is a phenomenon where, well, it can happen in many ways. One way is, a state worker say retires from one position, starts drawing retirement from that position, but then goes back to work for another agency, and draws a salary. That's one example of double dipping. The most egregious examples come out of California, where you're able to inflate your salaries by working 2 or 3 or 4 jobs because in California they take like your last year's salary. So if you work like 4 jobs your last year, making $300,000, you get, as Paul mentioned, 90% of that for the rest of your life. So it's a very perverse incentive, and that's an extreme form of double dipping. And I don't know how bad it is, particularly in New Mexico, but it is an issue. And what does it do? Well, it drives up costs.
Well, it would be bound to help if we didn't have that, right?
It would help?
It would help if we didn't have double dipping.
Oh, absolutely. And what's ironic about it is state government workers don't like it any more than we do, because it's unfair. That you can have these folks do this, because it hurts them too. Because you're paying for their pensions, and that increases cost, and then, it's another cost.
Would you expect to see the several states that are in worse shape seriously consider switching over to a defined contribution with the new employees? In other words, these states that you're visiting, do you suspect they'll find this solution attractive?
Well, it's clash of the titans, right? It's very attractive from a taxpayer-friendly perspective, and folks who want to do the right things for taxpayers, but at the same time, unions hate it. So it's just a question of who has the power, right? It's hard to answer that question.
Well, you've looked at all the states, so how about the states that are doing the best? What are they doing different from all these other states? The ones that aren't in this deep shit.
In terms of unfunded pensions? Or
Yeah, all of this right here. I mean, obviously, we're hearing the worst, and you're pointing out the examples, and we're part of the worst. So are there some states that are doing exceptionally well, and what are they doing different from all the ones that aren't doing well?
Well, my home state of New Hampshire ranks 49th on that GDP scale that I showed you as the total liabilities. What do they do right? Well, I mean, a lot of it's cultural. In New Hampshire right now, we have a Democratic governor fighting the unions for cost savings. I mean, where do you hear that in any other state? Why does that exist? Well, even Democrats in New Hampshire face pressure from constituents to keep costs under control. So it's really hard to say what causes, but there are very few states. I mean, when you look at total liabilities over the entire country, using those academics' estimates, if I remember, I don't have the paper in front of me, I was looking at policy if you had one. I think it's somewhere in the order of $1 to $3 trillion. So nobody's doing very well on this issue. And the sheer size of this is big enough to really force states to make bankruptcy an option.
Well, in that case, why don't they just pass their liability over to Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation?
Well, it's a good thing, it's interesting you bring that up, because I haven't read the 2,000-page healthcare bill, but apparently I understand there is some language in there that will federalize state healthcare systems. So in a way, what you're saying is true. I think is already starting to happen. I mean, obviously, the administration's under considerable influence from the unions, and the unions would like nothing more than all these to become the federal government's problem, because unlike the states, the federal government can borrow, which is kind of odd to borrow to pay a debt, but hey, it happens.
Basically, what you're saying is they'll inflate it away.
Yes, if you keep borrowing too much like we're doing, we're staring inflation.
A question for Kent, does anybody up there have the backbone to address these issues right now?
Not up until now. I mean, there's been a few people in positions of influence, like John Arthur Smith, that have had the presence of mind to start talking about it a number of years ago. but because of the administration's zealousness, really have fallen on deaf ears. I mean, the Richardson administration was much more interested in spaceports and trains to look glitzy and glamorous than to really fix the root of you know, what is gonna become a huge problem.
It already is, we're just hiding it.
Yeah, it's been swept under the rug. It's like Medicaid. I mean, it takes longer than a 4-year term to fix it, so no governor's gonna tackle it. I mean, it's sad, but it's true. It's gonna take a committed legislature to go in there. And say,
Until this starts happening.
yeah, until this starts happening. And
What was
then
it
it's,
that you
it's kind of self-evident after that, I guess. But no, up until now, no,
You mean the
not
pension
with
funds?
any amount of success.
Okay, let's say this does start happening with New Mexico, and our future, our borrowing rates go higher. And does that mean it's gonna be harder to get bond obligations passed?
I would think so. I mean, because the cost will go up.
And
And,
we might not have as many of them go by, and then our debt might actually go down.
you're an optimist.
If we just go broke, which we look like we are, nobody's gonna get anything anyway. It's gone.
Isn't that ultimately easier though, in as much as then a bankruptcy court in turn nullifies your contract with unions or any kind of pensionary contract?
Theoretically, but nobody's tested it yet, so we'll see.
They have. Chapter 9 has worked in California in a couple of cities,
Yeah, cities, but not states.
United States.
Yes,
So
sir.
that was my question, has any state in the union actually filed for bankruptcy?
No, not to my
Protection.
knowledge, no. And, you know, and the unknown wild card is, would the federal government rise to the rescue before that happened?
The question is,
Borrowed money.
Right, but borrow money.
So Scott, looking back in time, I don't know if you've done any historical analysis, but is the root cause of this legislators overpromising? I mean, why do all of our, and I remember when I worked for a couple of government agencies and the retirement benefits were just unbelievable.
Well, I mean, think about
So
it.
that's why, I'll take this job and get this huge,
Costs are amortized over 30
huge
years.
benefit.
And particularly, and I don't know if this is necessarily the case in New Mexico, but generally speaking in the country, in the late 90s when the stock market was just booming, you could, funded ratios were going up on their own just because asset values were going up. And so you could make a promise of benefits and basically it was free money.
That's right.
Make a promise that wouldn't, and of course, when you're looking at only a 4-year term, it's free money. You make all these grand promises and the cost is 30 years down the road. That's why you've seen now an explosion of liabilities as the stock market has finally gone the other way, and those benefits are working their way into the actuarial reports.
I'm in the University of California retirement system, and there was a time period when we had to make contributions, and then that went away, and haven't had to make
Right.
a contribution
Right.
ever again since.
Yeah, because it was a free promise to you.
Yeah.
And my experience has been, when you go to an agency or a bureaucracy or whatever it is, looking for the enabling legislation for what these entitlements are, they usually can't find the enabling legislation because they don't know where it is.
Right. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, how many of you follow the collective bargaining negotiations with the unions?
No,
Yeah.
I used to, UAW.
I mean, it's a completely non-transparent process. It's done behind closed doors. That's where these results end up, however. So, yes, sir?
Hypothetically speaking, assuming New Mexico did go declare bankruptcy, should the federal government come to the rescue?
But it will then.
I would argue no, but the political reality is, would they? I would say probably yes. Now, another issue I want to bring up real quick. Okay. Oh, let's go ahead. Yes, sir.
Mr. Moody, you're explaining things that would benefit the people. Can you switch gears and talk about what can benefit the government? For example, a recent example is the Soviet bloc. When the Soviets had certain promises to their workers, and then the Soviet bloc collapsed, and so did the currencies. All those obligations disappeared. The baby boomers at that time, they they lived in poverty for 20 years, and now everything's been redone. With any hyperinflation or currency devaluation, how can that actually benefit the government? Not the people, but the government.
Well, that's the issue. I mean, historically speaking, countries that run as much debt as we're running now and projected to run into the future almost inevitably result in extreme devaluations of their currency. That hurts everybody, government, taxpayers, and it's a fundamental cancer of an economy. So that's what I'm talking about here is, in a sense, we're all concerned about the debt we can see, like general obligation debt or federal T-bills. This is a new debt that we haven't been able to see. It's been lurking in the shadows, and it's 3 times larger than the state's general obligation debt, potentially up to 3 times larger. So when you talk about will we face calamitous devaluation or hyperinflation or any of the really serious afflictions, this is ultimately what causes it, is highly excessive borrowing. Does that answer your question?
Have you looked at any best practices outside the United States, any countries?
No, I have not.
So not like even, for instance, Scandinavian countries that have a high degree of government spending and social entitlements?
No. Frankly, I don't think those would be countries to look at, but I don't know.
I'm just looking for one remaining country in which to migrate to.
Australia.
Given that there's not a state.
Well, and let me just quickly give you another horrifying example of debt and of misuse of debt is in Illinois in 2003, they took out a $10 billion pension obligation bond to pay first their current year's obligation, which is a big no-no, but also to inject $7 billion into the fund one time. Now the problem with that, which is there are many problems with that, but first is they paid on average 5.05% in interest. They have to now earn 5.05% interest just to go to zero in terms of making money. And what it does is actually enhances risk-taking, not reduce it. So now the state is investing in even riskier investment schemes in order to make money, essentially, on these bonds. Secondly, the whole structure of these bonds was very crazy. Number one, it ends up being a 3-year interest-only loan. The first 3 years, it was nothing but interest. There was no principal. In fact, they're now 5 years into the bond, and they've paid exactly $100 million in principal. They're going to end up paying $11-something billion in interest on a $10 billion 30-year note. That virtually assures that they are going to lose money on this deal, which means that taxpayers, after this whole thing takes place, will actually owe more money to the pension system before they took the pension obligation bond. And to make matters worse, if they could be, the bonds are also non-callable, which means they can't pay them off early if they wanted to. So the taxpayers of Illinois are locked into a 30-year, very bad deal that was done for political reasons because they paid 1 year's. Now, 1 year's contribution in Illinois is on the order of, at the time, $2 to $3 billion. So what did they do with that $2 to $3 billion? They closed their budget gap.
Maybe all the states should just elect a bunch of drunken sailors to their legislature. Couldn't do any worse than this.
I think they already have.
Okay.
I've listened to Scott's presentation now several times throughout the last couple of days. So there's a few things that I picked up on that I wanted to throw out there that he may have omitted. But one, the most radical idea for helping mitigate this problem, there's no silver bullet, I think we all agree, but embarking on a radical strategy of economic growth and growing the private sector. And it's kind of the one that people look at and say, how can you dare grow the private sector? We were up with Matt Kinnicott in the House Republican staffer, and it's just kind of a joke. But if you grow the private sector, it makes this all shrink as a problem, one thing that you can do. And also on the bankruptcy, someone talked about bankruptcy, and that property rights issue still, bankruptcy is not a get out of jail free card as far as I know. Now, the courts are discussing this and there are going to be lawsuits over the years, but you could declare bankruptcy and still be stuck with those pension with the labor liabilities and pension liabilities. Could be. I'm not it's not a guarantee. It'll depend on what the courts in New Mexico say. But I don't think there's a hard and fast rule nationwide saying
It's never
this
been
is the
done.
way it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's never been done. So, again, you're relying on the courts, and the courts were the ones who also made the pensions a private property right. There's nothing standing in the way of them continuing to do that. And also, let's not forget on the healthcare side, which currently are not a private property right, the unions have several court cases pending right now, including one against West Virginia for eliminating it, that could, if they go the wrong way, set precedent for also making that a property right, which would really put us in a pickle.
The one thing that happened in California in a Chapter 9 bankruptcy that I looked at pretty closely, and I've been involved in some Chapter 9s, which are municipal bankruptcies, is that they were able to amend labor contracts to address some of the existing pension obligations over time. And the bankruptcy courts have actually held in that particular case that, yeah, you can, just like you might see private sector unions have to renegotiate their union contracts, particularly for airlines. The same thing goes for municipal workers.
Right.
They have to renegotiate their contracts and the contributions that are made to defined benefit plans.
Right. That is certainly a possibility. Nobody knows.
Well, isn't that part of a two-pronged program? I understand California's looking at not only declaring bankruptcy so that they can negotiate anew with the same unions, so that you create the employees that have the old plan, and then whatever new plan you come up with as part of satisfying court bankruptcy. Because wouldn't the courts be motivated to allow for a modification or a separate contract from this point forward? There'd be no reason for the court to want a state to come back out of bankruptcy unless they could show that they would have contracts that would be more fiscally appropriate.
Right.
And then that coupled with the fact, I guess you were being cute, Paul, facetious, because Kennedy and Reagan grew the economy. That was their solution to stabilizing the growth rate. They grew growth, they created growth in order to stabilize the amount of inflation that they were willing to accept.
It just seems like we're sitting back here saying, well, can the government help, and what are we gonna do? Well, the government is us, and we are the government, and nobody can help but us, and we need to crash, because the private sector will not grow as long as there's anybody there to help, because people have gotten, help me, help me, help me. Let it fall. Private sector will grow. The government ain't gonna be able to do anything anyway because it's us. When we're all out of work, who's gonna pay their salary?
Well, but the collateral damage of that could be
It's not, I mean,
very bad.
well, there's not really an answer, is there?
No, it is a very tough answer, and it's going to be a lot of pain. There's no doubt about it. No doubt about it.
We need some huge revenue enhancers, they call, huh?
Well,
Mike, did you talk, when you said Chapter 9, that's municipal bankruptcy? Were you referring to the Orange County?
Orange was one, there's another one, Viejo out there.
And that was just Orange County
I've
failure.
been involved
to-
in 3 or 4 up in Colorado.
yes, sir.
Well, I mean, it does grate on your nerves when you hear politicians say, gee, we're in a down economy and we've done all this to preserve government workers, we haven't fired anybody. And we all know instinctively that we're overemployed in government in New Mexico. And so you know, going to your chart where you said, you know, if we just reduced to the national average, you know, how do you overcome what do you do with the people that you lay off? I guess that's really the bottom line.
Well, let them join the rest of us.
Well, that's why I suggest,
I used to have that kind of anger, and it didn't get me anywhere.
well, that's why I suggest a hiring freeze and let voluntary terminations
Right.
solve the problem, because theoretically, voluntary termination either is into retirement or another job, so you don't end up with a lot of
The deal there
unemployment.
is that you're gonna push more people into this retirement program in the short run.
Well, there's nothing you can do about, but there's nothing you can do about their cost anyways. It's going to be either today or tomorrow.
Yeah, but you'd like to make it tomorrow on the
Yeah,
present
well,
value.
the pain's gonna come regardless, Mike.
Yeah, but you want that pain to be out there.
But if you get them out of the system, also you truncate the liability you'll owe them, too. If they stay in the workforce, they're gonna accrue higher and higher liabilities. So, yeah, it's sort of a catch-22 problem. Yes, sir.
So assuming just the overemployment, if the state tomorrow were to fire the X number of people to return us to the national average, how many would that be? Does that represent, you know,
Yeah,
5%
I have that number, and I thought about putting it in the presentation. Drop me an email and I'll send it to you, but it's, out of 170,000 people, you're looking at, I think, something like 80,000. It's a lot.
I think the whole workforce of the state is about 900,000.
Yeah.
So that would represent,
How many federal employees are in the state?
Too many.
A lot. I don't know. Yeah, this is all, we're not even counting federal employment in any of these
So
numbers.
would that push it to 40% of maybe of the total workforce?
Not that
Government?
high, but it's significant. Yeah. I can get the numbers for you, but, yes, sir.
So, my question then is, you're suggesting to us, as the legislature comes into session here, and those of us that are gonna go up there and approach these guys, that we should be suggesting that they take a two-pronged approach. Number one, we wanna work on getting businesses in this state rolling again, and we need to work on a significant attrition in government employment. That's what is there a third prong, or?
Well, the third prong is to fix the defined benefit program, and
That's what I'm getting out of this.
moving to a defined contribution
Move
system.
to
Because if you
defined-
just get rid of people and hire people back under the old system, you know, you somewhat mitigated the liability because a new person's just starting into the system, but you're fundamentally not changing it.
So you're actually being a realist and saying that, no, you're not gonna get any reduction in this overemployment in the state, you might as well just swallow that and say, yeah.
Well, no, I
let's
think
keep
you
it at
need
25% over,
both.
but
I
get these
think
guys
you need
into
both
defined
working.
benefits.
You need both of them working together.
Okay.
Because when you fix the overemployment problem, you're getting those huge savings for every position that's gone permanently.
Right.
But then you're still going to have natural turnover that you're going to need to hire somebody new. And you don't want to perpetuate the problem. You want to make sure that that new person coming in that you do need is in another system.
I want to address
So what you would also do is force people to, in this type of an environment, to work longer. And those people at a certain age group, say 40 or younger, say, look, you guys are going to the defined contribution angle, you guys that are 40 and older.
Well, no, you can't do that. It has to be new versus old worker because of the private property issue.
And I wanted to address one thing about you said getting business moving. And I thank you for going up to Santa Fe and doing this. This is something totally new in New Mexico, the activism that we've seen from tea parties and all this stuff. I'm sure Kent and everyone up there who's fighting the good fight appreciates that. But you can't give these guys too much wiggle room. And when you say get business moving again, what the governor or what some of these guys are going to hear is, we need to subsidize business to come here to New Mexico. I know, I'm just saying what they hear. Their ears don't work like the mere mortals that we are. They work differently. And so we have hundreds and hundreds of businesses and industries, oil and gas, mining, all this other stuff that is already here, doesn't need a government handout, and can change this problem. Sending 25% more of our money to the film industry is not going to help the problem. So I just want to make sure that you're using very, very concise and very particular and accurate language when dealing with these guys.
Those were libertarian code words for tax cuts.
Well,
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think tax cuts are realistic. As much as I love tax cuts, I don't think you're gonna get them realistically. I think there's ways to end the regulatory
Regulations.
problems that are cost-free to the government, that you can realistically do, like pit rules and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I mean, Ken's probably got a
Well,
list of.
if you heard Bob Gallagher talk yesterday at the NAOP luncheon about the pit rules and about the devastating effect, and that if you remove those, almost instantly you would see rigs coming back into the state that have opted out of New Mexico, because we've got third largest reserve of natural gas in the country. We could produce and never make a dent, and that would be nothing but good for the economy. But this governor, what he's done is he's set up a system where he can retaliate against oil companies that didn't do what he wanted them to do a few years ago. And a red county, San Juan County, he can retaliate against that county. That's basically what this is all about. It's a vendetta. It had nothing to do with what's good for the state. And I will throw that out there. And if there's some Richardson fans in here, you got to know that that's what he's doing.
So what is the approach to get these people to vote him out?
First of all, he's got to be gone. We're very close to that end, just naturally. The second thing is we need some help in the House and the Senate. I don't care if they're Republicans or Democrats, but they got to think a little more reasonably about.
So what would it take in our state legislature to reverse these pet laws?
Well, in the legislature, it can be done legislatively. We just need the votes to get it done, to override the regulatory influence.
It's the oil and gas conservation.
What's the committee that's, or committee?
Well, it's the Environmental Improvement Division, the OCD, whatever Ron Curry touches, basically is largely
They insulate this
responsible.
stuff from democracy by putting it into these commissions and various things.
Yeah, so it's a commission and not a committee.
Well, if you look at the special session, Richardson wrote the bill in his proclamation. When we didn't deliver on it, and we wrote legislation and passed it as a group, he trumped that with executive orders.
So
And
what can New Mexicans do to get around these, not necessarily the executive orders, we'd have to change too much for that, but how do we get around these goofball commissions and things that are off on the side that
regulatory
might
justice
pass you guys?
reform, basically, is what we've been
Regulatory
working on for years. Stuart Engel has been a champion. I've been there with him, and it's regulatory justice is what it
Regulatory
is.
justice.
Cat, seriously, isn't a pit rule or regulatory justice just another way to say a tax?
No. I'm saying get rid of,
Don't view them as the same thing as that?
No, because the regulatory environment just says that you don't need the legislature to make these decisions anymore. The legislature, which is us, as you know, as people first, and I'm just a conduit for you all. Is the legislature being able to have an influence over the cabinet secretaries and all the bureaucracy, getting rid of those guys. I think.
No, I agree, but isn't the effect to somebody trying to do business, he has to deal with a legislature or worse, a regulatory, which is what you're saying, a worse entity. Isn't the effect on his business a cost that's equivalent to taxation?
If the regulatory environment is hostile, yes.
Yes.
If we can reverse that trend, which Johnson was pretty good at doing. Other governors, but even King had a pretty good sense of regulatory justice and
I'm
what it
just saying
meant.
that when, it's interesting because Paul wants to concentrate on certain areas, but the net effect is the same as reducing a tax. Because the effect on the business owners is costly.
The effect on the business owners, but when you talk, if you go up to Santa Fe and you walk into a legislator's office and say, I want to cut taxes, they'll look at you like you jumped out of Roswell in one of the spaceships. If you say, I want to reduce regulation that will stifle or is stifling economic development, they look at that differently. They're looking for it as government's got a hole in its pocket and money's been flying out for the last 8 years. And how do we stop that hole, or
They would generate more revenue from businesses.
That's one way,
that
yeah.
That find it friendly to be here.
So,
Yes.
not changing the whole subject here. We got an hour and a half, we're at an hour and a half here. We're kind of having a more casual discussion, which is great, so we can continue that for as long as you want. But thank you all for coming, and if you want to grab something to eat before you leave, or if you want to continue hanging out here, we'll give you another 15, 20 minutes. So.
I kind of have a question.
I have a question for Senator Cravens here. Ken, over the years, the higher educational expenses that have been bloated, according to his graph and all, have there been people who wanted to make allocation changes or perhaps mission changes?
You know what I would like to do is I'd like to see one board of regents for all of higher ed in New Mexico to manage all the schools. I'd like to see a reduction in the number of those schools. I think we have, 30 venues for higher education in New Mexico, all conveniently named after some legislator. So, that's the problem, is it's just too big and there's just too much of it. And with the advent of the internet, we could do a lot in closing those gaps with technology. That's kind of what I like to see.
There's probably been discussion, but no real action.
Yeah, just a lot of talk. We talk about a lot of stuff. When all is said and done, more gets said than done.
How do these regulatory agencies get more power than Congress?
It's the court system, because somebody tries it in the court system, and the liberal court system finds in favor of the agency a lot of times, and it's detrimental.
Yeah, I mean, the federal EPA's authority now to regulate carbon dioxide came from the Supreme Court. Certainly.
Can't we get rid of some of these, like the Environmental Improvement Board? I mean, that's a board appointed by the governor.
You mean the
I
Green
mean, if the
Energy,
governor
Green
can-
Energy Board?
Can enact them, can't the governor take them away?
It's only for back pocket.
Well, we can do anything we want. I mean, if we have enough numbers.
If we can get the legislature to do it.
If we can have the numbers to get it done, we can do anything we want.
So in other
We
words,
can either make it worse or we can clean it up. And it depends on the voters and who we can get in those
But
seats.
working on the legislature is the place to work.
That's a place to start, yeah. And getting rid of this governor is gonna be a breath of fresh
I
air.
plan to be in Santa Fe for as much as I can during this first session for 4 weeks, 3 days. So who are the best people I should try to wheedle up to and ask a few questions of?
Well, it depends. If we can put a package together and offer what we consider to be our solution, and, Republicans always get dinged because, well, you guys always say no, no, no,
Well,
but
I'm
you never have a
independent.
solution.
I don't care.
Okay, but I'm just saying, it's not the Republicans that are up there whittling away our freedoms. It's usually liberal Democrats, not moderate
Are you
Republicans.
too late to introduce bills right
No,
now?
no. We can introduce bills all the way up until halfway through the
So
session.
what do you know about this SJR too?
Well, I mean, it's an opt-out of the healthcare plan. It's a great start. It's gonna be a great discussion. However, we don't have the numbers to get it done. There's no way in the world the House is ever gonna pass this.
If enough
Because,
people show up?
well,
It's gonna be more than people, we've gotta give them justification for it.
you got it, well,
Well, I think there's-
And they're too used to getting their money from the Fed, so they don't know how to stand on their own two feet.
Hey, Ken, one question is, you got a huge Medicare issue, because at the end of this year, 2010, the federal support of our Medicare comes to an end. How are you guys plugging that? Or,
well, that's another good question. How are we gonna do any of this?
I think that's $80 million.
I propose we have Ken come and speak to us soon.
Let's make it after the session.
I just want to thank Scott again for coming, and then maybe if we want to be more casual and direct questions to Kent, we can do that. But if you have some questions for Scott right now before we let him kind of sit down.
This is off policy. I'm just curious, when you were at George Mason, did you run into Walter Williams very much?
I went to George Mason because of Walter Williams, so he was I had him for my first semester, and my wife has a funny story, because that's where I first met my wife, because she was in graduate school too. She's the smart one, she actually has her PhD, but I was just there to absorb Walter's insights, and So she has some funny stories. Yes, sir.
I understand you've talked to governor candidates about this, and have they all in some way wanted to employ one of these solutions? And secondly, is there any point to talking to Diane Dennis or somebody from Governor Richardson's office?
Everybody we've talked to has been very receptive to everything we had to say, and we're actually pretty well informed to begin with. So yeah, I thought they all went great.
How about those two Democrats?
Oh well, they didn't invite us.
Okay.
Not that the invitation wasn't extended.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Thank you so much for coming, and Scott, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott.